Welcome everyone, good afternoon. My name is Lynn Vartan, as you know, and I'm one of the co-directors of our laser series. We are so happy to welcome Patricia Olynyk today. Patricia has done so many things as an artist, administrator, educator, researcher, and I'm so excited here to learn. A little bit of housekeeping as we get started. We have a lot of activities this week. The Institute for Applied Creativity, as you know, supports fully our laser series, and this is our March event. The news that we have for you is our April event has been postponed until the fall. We have some travel things that have come up, but Avital Meshi will be here in the fall for us and will actually be here longer in residence at that time. So lots of activities going on. We also are starting our inaugural IAC Presents series next week, which I will be performing in the D Gallery. So if you want more information on that, please let us know. But today is all about Patricia Olynyk's work, and I'm so excited to see what she's going to share with us. Again, her experience is incredibly diverse, incredibly interdisciplinary, and her work as both administrator, educator, and above all, supreme artist is really inspiring. Welcome, Patricia.
I certainly hope I can live up to those expectations. Thank you for such a generous introduction, and thank you everyone for joining me here today. This is such a distinct pleasure to be able to share my work with you. I know these laser talks are relatively short, so I decided I was really going to focus primarily on one project which I have been working on for, if you can imagine, 20 years. I actually counted last night while I was in bed at the George, thinking, how long have I been working on this project? 20 years. So as a research-based multimedia artist and also writer and educator who bridges art with other disciplines, including medical humanities. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on today, is sort of working with medical humanities and anatomical archives. A little bit closer. Yeah, I can't get closer to the podium. I'll be sitting on it if I... Does that work? Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. So I've widely explored both the historical and contemporary uses of a lot of photographic technology. So that includes microscopy, VR, MRI. I'm going to be talking about other artists that use video capsule, hydrocell geodesic sensors. And all of these have been employed in medical science to probe the intricate landscape hidden beneath the skin. And so this presentation is going to focus really on the Mutable Archive, A Cure for Immortality, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a little bit, and its relationship to a course that I teach in medical humanities called The Art of Medicine. In the Art of Medicine, I co-teach with a science historian, Professor Rebecca Messbarger, and my contribution to that course is really looking at the visual culture of the advancement of medicine, but mostly contemporary artists who are using medicine as both a subject and a topic and a method of some kind. So still very much connected to the discourse of the art world, but really working with ideas and themes in medicine in order to produce work. So I'm at Washington University in St. Louis, and when you are at an R1 and you're trying to bridge disciplines, you end up with all these funny titles. So I almost sort of, these are half of what I have, so I'm really working a lot across campus. But the reason I'm mentioning the class is because the artwork and the coursework co-evolve and cross-inform one another quite a bit. So, okay, so within the field of medicine, photography, scanning electron microscopy, hydrocell geodesic sensor nets known as electroencephalograph, CAPS, and functional MRIs are all scanning devices that are standardized diagnostic tools which are used to capture visual representation of a patient's condition, allowing typically healthcare providers to analyze, physical diseases and abnormalities in appearance, where files and sort of share files, right? So the photographs are file sharing mechanisms, and obviously these photographic technologies are meant to aid in the treatment planning and delivery of care. So the medical photograph possesses a kind of truth value from which the so-called accurate depictions of a patient's ailment can be captured, communicated, and in legal cases actually used as a form of evidence. Now, the criteria for the photographic image as evidence rests on two markers, and that is relevance and authenticity. So how should we interpret the photographic image produced with diagnostic imaging technologies that are interpreted out of context? Or in cases where, according to Michel Foucault's concept of the medical gaze, the doctor is not the primary proxy. We are the primary proxy. So take, for example, these collage artworks composed of micro and macro images that I exhibited, again, 20 years ago at the National Academy of Sciences in Washington, D.C. If not viewed through the biomedical lens within a clinical paradigm, would you even recognize that the tissue samples contained therein are transgenic? How might we interpret this power dynamic given that the viewer's gaze is not actively shaping a patient's experience? So again, the medical image taken out of context becomes something quite different. Even the hydrocell geodesic sensor net used to image brainwave activity isn't foolproof. Poor electrode contact, improper placement, or faulty electrodes can lead to unreliable results. This is me with Mark Cohen when I was visiting UCLA's neuroscience, Semel Institute Neuroscience for Neuroscience. And Mark Cohen is extremely proud of his MRI machine. So this is, of course, where we also image the human brain. But the desire to understand human biology in relationship to human behavior is unrelenting, right? It's unrelenting. And our belief in technology's capacity to picture the exact location of where personality resides, it persists. It started many, many, many centuries ago, and it persists today. So this is two fMRIs from two subjects, one with what is considered to be a normal range of blood flow to the prefrontal cortex, that is 50 millimeters per 100 grams of brain tissue per minute. Who knew? And one with far less, bearing evidence of potential antisocial behavior. That's the sample that you're looking, or the image you're looking at on your left. The problem is, of course, that compromised blood flow to the prefrontal cortex can indicate any number of conditions. It doesn't mean you are a serial killer if your brain looks like that on the left. But nonetheless, we use these images, and we're using these images particularly as they relate to criminology, theories of criminology, to determine sort of antisocial behavior. So the scientific study of crime began in 1871 in Italy with Cesare Lombroso, a comparative physiognomist, psychiatrist, and prison doctor at an asylum for the criminally insane. And in this documentary, or perhaps staged photograph, we don't know, an official uses calipers and craniometers to calculate the degree of relative so-called disproportion of the subject. The resulting data is used to chart the relationship between the micro and macro features of the face for measurable stigmata that can predict criminal or antisocial behavior. So the nature-nurture argument within these measurements is extremely controversial. If you believe that behavior is biologically determined, as Cesare Lombroso believed, this pardons the subject from wrongdoing. If you say it's socially determined, then this also becomes a deeply political argument. So nothing is easy with these pseudosciences. And we, of course, we know that with Paul Michel Doria Foucault, or you probably have heard of The Birth of the Clinic, Foucault was a 20th century French philosopher, historian of ideas, writer, political activist, and literary critic who coined the term medical gaze. And this is a highly reductive lens through which you look at the human as simply a set of biological systems, right? So in the 18th century, medicine underwent a major transformation. For the first time, medical knowledge took on a precision that had formerly only belonged to mathematics. So what ended up happening is this major transformation in medicine became very precise, but it also became distributed. So perhaps democratized, but distributed. So drawing from this strange pseudoscience, I started a project that began with a question. What can an image with an unstable narrative paradoxically reveal about truth? How might we reconcile the multitude of competing narratives that underlie these images in a world that is always more complex than the human mind can fathom in its totality? So the Mutable Archive is an anthology, a collaborative, cross-disciplinary, multimedia art installation that combines 4K cinematic video projection, spatialized sound, live performance, and storytelling. Research and speculation are united in the interrogation of an anatomical collection to expose the role of assumption and subjectivity in science. The project draws on photographs, which I took myself, from two anatomical museums, the Narrenturm in Vienna, which you see here, and the Narrenturm is in Vienna. It's part of the medical university there, and it's Europe's oldest former asylum. And the second location is the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, where an anatomical collection of skulls that was assembled by anatomist Dr. Josef Hertel, Viennese anatomist, marked by post-mortem inscriptions and paired with archive cards, are only able to give us a kind of partial, fragmentary story about the subjects contained within that collection. So the project begins, as I said, with Josef Hertel. He was a very, I did work with an archives director in Vienna who knew a lot about the history of Josef Hertel. He was an extremely philanthropic person, put together a lot of different collections, and then that collection ended up being split between two continents, between the US and Vienna. And so I visited both, but most of these 19 photographs I shot myself at the Mutter Museum when I was an artist in residence there. And here you can see that each photograph contains a human subject, just the inscription on the side of the cranium, and an accompanying archive card. Here are details of two of the subjects in the collection. The first one is the skull of Francesca Secoro, who seems to sort of be the star of the collection in Philadelphia, a collection of 139 skulls in Philadelphia. And the second one is a Dutch suicide. And as you can see by the overwriting in the second card, an archivist has gone into the original inscription and has circled the word suicide and says, don't know how we got this, right? So in other words, this is unreliable information, and it points to the fact that so much information is tacit, right? That this might have been information that the person receiving the skull knew about, but there was actually nothing else that was provided on that card to reaffirm that in fact this person was in fact a suicide. So working from these records, which are partial and unreliable, I invite collaborators from across fields to write and then perform speculative narratives around these subjects, foregrounding how, again, assumption and subjectivity shape what it is that we accept as knowledge. And I work together with these collaborators to consider the meaning of evidence, ethics and interpretation as we bridge historical and archival research with critical theory and speculative narrative to fill in blanks left in the historical record. Now this aligns with critical fabulation, a term coined by Saidiya Hartman, who describes these gaps in historical record as they relate to sort of slave histories, but it's equally true for these medical collections because you basically ended up in one of these collections if you were underprivileged and you had nobody to claim your body, or you were executed, you could easily end up in one of these collections. So each collaborator's script is recorded and integrated into a 4K video that reveals complex issues related to racial profiling, gender bias, and class disparity, while demonstrating the fictitious foundations of human taxonomy. And I'll show a few excerpts from this piece itself. And this also reminds me of a conversation I had with art theorist and a critical theorist in Berlin, Jan Vervoort, who wrote that the essay is a medium that does not obey the laws of scientific methodology, but rather is the result of the relationship between the author and the object of their reflection. And this exactly mirrors what's happening with my project. The stories are really about the writer's relationship to the subject that they choose. So these skulls, which have the meaning of which has migrated from sort of personhood to object, right? They become objects of reflection for the collaborator, who is then confronted in a very empathetic way. The author sets the logic of continuity characteristic of the scientific method against that of discontinuity. The essay could end at any point or continue ad infinitum. So these are really the characteristics that situate the Mutable Archive. And this is, again, Jan Vervoort is citing a text by Adorno from the 1958 essay. Let's see, Der Essay als Form in the Uncommon Place. That is, I think, a beautiful sort of footprint or kind of anchor for the work. So each performance amplifies a kind of congregation of hidden voices, the entanglement of art, performance, the humanities, and science, and all of these constitute the connective tissue that links stories, sounds, and texts, which extend abstract perspectives on identity and embodiment. And the Mutable Archive also exposes the practice of collecting anatomical specimens around the world in an attempt to make sense of it. So, we're talking about a 19th century collection. Hertel himself did not participate in colonial projects, but he certainly would have acquired skulls from people who did. And as I say, he was known to be a very, sort of philanthropic person who gave a lot of money and resources to orphanages in Vienna in the 19th century. And he amassed not only human remains, human skulls, but animal bones, taxidermied specimens. He has a huge collection of medical devices, wet specimens, prosthetic arms and legs. And his reason for amassing this enormous collection was to gift these collections to the future. He did not believe in physiognomy. He did not believe that the micro and macro features of the face said anything about your personality, but this was meant to be a gift to the future. So I'm going to show you now one short clip from one of my collaborators' videos. Chelsea Knight selected Veronica Huber, who was a young 18 or 19-year-old young woman who was found guilty of infanticide. She killed her child. And we know the conditions in the 19th century were very severe for unmarried women. If you were, for example, raped by the master of the household and you were, a sort of live-in maid or housekeeper, you would be put out on the street if you were found to be pregnant. So a lot of women were put in very, very difficult circumstances, and So this Veronica Huber was executed at a very young age, and Veronica Huber's story is told by Chelsea Knight, who is a terrific video artist based in between Vermont and New York. And Chelsea's story is also a mashup story. So she is combining Veronica Huber's speculated history with her own history as that of being the daughter of a healer with Hamlet. And she intertwines these three stories beautifully in this clip. So let's take a look.
I want the paper, but all I can see is my father. My father says, energy is coming out of my hands. Hands. Are Veronica and I related? Kindred? Connected? Has her spirit passed? Must there no more be done? No more be done. We should profane the service of the dead to sing a requiem and such rest to her as to peace-parted souls. Lay her in the earth, and from her fair and unpolluted flesh may violets spring. I tell thee, churlish priest, a ministering angel shall my sister be when thou liest howling. What? The fair Ophelia? Sweets to the sweet. Farewell.
So Chelsea is a particularly brilliant writer, as is Shimon Addy, a New York-based artist of international fame, incredible writer as well, and he selected a young woman from Kazan.
Alexandra had brought shame and disrepute upon her parents and family, and Mora had committed the ultimate transgression between Muslim and Jew. On October 20th, 1869, they were both dragged by the mob to Kassam's main square. Just before the stones landed, their last two words, whispered in unison and barely audible, were, "We confess." Two lives were thus extinguished on the shores of the Caspian Sea on a mid-autumn day.
So those are just two clips from the sort of the straightforward video project, which was really the Mutable Archive, which has now been turned into, I'm sorry, the slides are so difficult to see. They're very bright on my computer. You can come up later and take a look, but I just worked with my cinematographer on a live performance piece, a 45-minute long performance work at the Experimental Media Lab, Experimental Media and Performance Lab at UC Irvine. Was hosted there by the Chancellor and the Medical Humanities probably about 1 month ago. And here we're cross-cutting between the different stories and also including a live recitation. And so it was incredible to have this performance, probably about 18, I think the screen was about 18 feet high and 45 feet wide. So there we are performing on stage. Just a few shots. And here's the sizzler for the work. So this is something we put up on Instagram, so the format is vertical. Sorry. So the wonderful thing about working with Adam Hogan, my cinematographer, is that for the live performance, we actually, then he really stepped up and we began this iteration of the project. The Cure for Immortality is, of course, you have no history. That's your cure for immortality. But he stepped up and we are now co-producing and co-directing the performance version. So I'll just briefly go through the art of medicine, which again is related to this. So I know some of you are pulling a lot of your research into your teaching, as I do. And for 10 years now, I've been co-teaching the art of medicine with Professor Messbarger. It's a Beyond Boundaries, which means an interdisciplinary course that is provost funded at Washington University. It's a medical humanities gateway course. And we look at other artists that are also working with photographic archives. So Kader Attia, who's a French-Algerian artist, juxtaposes notions of healing and repair by showing colonizing soldiers' faces which have been repaired, surgically repaired, which, the intention of which is to return them back to its original form, but with the artifact from the colonized culture, the culture itself can't ever be taken back to a point of origin. So he's really looking at what repair means biologically and what it means when, what it means when a culture can't be repaired. So he's confronting the damage to these colonized cultures rather than erasing it. Radcliffe Bailey, of course, credible artist, learned that markers in his DNA indicated a bloodline rooted in Sierra Leone and Guinea. So the shadow box becomes a kind of medicine cabinet whose magic is the reparative line from photographic to artifact to blood code that describes his own family's history, the Atlantic expanse across which Bailey reaches. And then, of course, we know Stellark, whose very provocative work includes the self-portrait where he's swallowing a small video capsule camera and then expelling it to do an internal portrait. And you may also know, or you may not know, the story of executed criminal Joseph Paul Jernigan. Willed his body to science before he was executed, but he could not have known that he would be turned into a downloadable data set. If you go to the National Library of Archives, you can download MRIs and representations of his body, photographic representations of his body and every different system that is contained therein. So the ethics behind the use of known bodies really becomes quite something. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about the controversy about using medical archives in projects, because, just to say a word in summary about the medical archive, of course, it is a project of interpretation that relocates the investigation of an archive from a specific location, right, a historically and geographically located repository of knowledge, something that is bureaucratically administered, to one in which visualizations and enactments of archival material allow for spaces of human action to emerge. So by expanding the concept of the archive and working with these commissioned writers, we sort of make potential knowledge production and reception accessible through new forms of agency, through the sort of now staging and performance of these archives. So the project also pushes new compelling questions to the surface that weren't being asked in the time of their acquisition. And these questions involve new interpretations of archival material from which counter-narratives begin to emerge. So the Mutable Archive connects the history of anatomical collecting and medical display to present-day debates about colonial violence, race, gender, class disparity, and cultural bias. Rather than treating the archives as neutral or static, the work highlights uneven documentation and the lasting effects of taxonomic thinking, including early eugenics frameworks. It deepens understanding of how the arts can help us approach institutional records with greater care, empathy, and accountability. So this is Erin McCleary, who is at the Mutter Museum, and she's quoted in this article about the Mutter as saying, specimens are the ways in which physicians in the 19th century were communicating ideas. And here she is at the Mutter opening one of the archive cases. So interesting story. So the controversy surrounding the Mutter Museum's human remains over the last few years include Joseph Hurtl's anatomical collection. And of course, it centers on the ethical provenance and display practices sparked by a 2023 investigation into non-Indigenous remains repatriation. So while the 139 skulls collected by Hurtl were initially collected in part to debunk 19th century theories on physiognomy, critics argue about the ethics of displaying human remains for public viewing. They were generally considered part of the scientific collection, though a more contentious issue involves the lack of consent and the potential exploitation of 19th century, again, often underprivileged subjects. So there's a lot of information coming out now through The Guardian and other sources about the repatriation of certain skulls from the collection. And something I'd like you to note is the placement of these skulls in the case. They are all side by side by side, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So the Mutter has been part of a much larger set of articles about America's biggest museums failing to return Native American human remains. A lot of links there. If you want me to send the links to you, I would be happy to do that. But I had a great conversation with a colleague at the College Art Association conference a few weeks ago who managed to acquire this centaur skeleton that was supposedly excavated at Volos in 1980. So there's a whole history behind this faux display. So Professor Beauvais-Lyons, who founded the Hoax Archive, acquired this. It was originally an installation by Will Willers at the University of Wisconsin that was put together in the 80s. With a teaching specimen of a human skull that had always been in the biology department for many years, and that was located 30 years ago in the University of Tennessee's Hodges Library, thanks to Beauvais-Lyons. One of the most visited displays, and in 30 years there had never been a single complaint about the installation, but in 2024, the university's repatriation committee swept in to remove the installation, claiming it was an affront to decency and possibly a violation of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, otherwise known as NAGPRA. The committee determined it must be reburied in Wisconsin to atone for its legacy of past harm, yet no DNA analysis was ever conducted on the human part of this centaur. It was determined later at some point that the centaur remains were in fact from Asia. Add to this that local tribes indicated, and here's where things get really interesting, local tribes indicated a spiritual connection had been created between the human remains and their associated parts, which is the human and the Shetland pony behind it. Also the fake artifacts that are around this. So this spiritual connection complicates repatriation. The centaur spiritually has also acquired a relationship with its encasement. So, not knowing what else to do, in consultation with tribal partners, the centaur has decided, they have decided to respectfully bury the centaur in Wisconsin. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia. We'll do our typical transition here to have some questions amongst ourselves and get into the conversation a little more. As always, if any of you have questions, we are most happy to entertain them. And as we're getting a little bit situated here, I will pass this mic we'll pass this one around between you two. I'll start with just a question as people are thinking. I was curious, with the Mutable Project, when you selected the writers and authors to design their stories, did they have absolute, complete agency to go any direction they wanted with the limited information that they had?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And none of this was forced. I found that I had the photographs displayed in my studio, and as I was doing studio visits with different colleagues and artist friends, that people really responded to certain subjects. So Buzz Spector, who was a colleague of mine at Washington University a number of years ago, conducted a studio visit, and then he didn't just say, wow, I'm really attracted to that Dutch suicide. He actually said, I am the Dutch suicide. And said, I'd really like to do something with this. And that precipitated the initial invitation. So that really kicked off the project. And Buzz Spector, in his video, is rising from the ocean that the Dutch suicide, in his story, committed suicide in and drowned. And he's sort of rising out of the ocean as a specter. So he's got a phantom-like presence as he's reciting his script. But his research involves a particular medical condition that the Dutch suicide had, if in fact she was a suicide. And she had an incorrect fusing of the prefrontal lobe sutures. So he talks about the sutures as the plate tectonics of the brain, and he researched this condition and said this would have caused her a lot of pain. So then he fabricates or comes up with some, possible conversations she might have had with her neighbors, telling her to empty her mind of its prickly baggage. And then his story ends with the line, in the gray Dutch weather, it became difficult to discern the difference between sea and sky. The waves lapped against the dike invitingly, and that's his story. Yeah.
Fantastic. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions from you all that you'd like to get going with? Otherwise, we will continue from here as well. Donna, do you have any questions, or I can always go.
I might have questions that are almost too big. I don't know. Because I'm thinking about something that you actually said to our grad students yesterday. We were very clear to say, there's a lot going on.
Sure, that's on. Perfect.
There's a lot going on in medical humanities, in collaborative work that involves applied art and is, useful and important, but that you said it's significant to carve out this space to distinguish that what you're doing is art as art and not in service of some kind of usefulness, for lack of a better word. So can you say something about why it's important to establish that space, especially vis-a-vis medicine?
Sure, absolutely. That is such an excellent question, and you are full of so many excellent questions. But it is a conversation that Donna and I have been having for some time now, is about the instrumentalization of the arts, right? That we have, let me just say, art is a field of knowledge. If you want to know how to be an artist, you go to school, you learn the history, you understand the conceptual underpinnings of what is driving production, right? It's a field of knowledge. This is really being forgotten in today's conversations on different campuses, right? And I am fully in support of art therapy programs and art that can serve other disciplines and make them more creative and make them more fundable, and even happy to pop into the occasional grant to decorate their project. But this is not the field of art. The field of art has its own set of inquiries. It has its own kind of conceptual set of foundations. It is important that the work that I produce is attached to the discourse of the art world. That is my field of knowledge. So this is the distinction that is very, very important to me. If somebody from medical humanities looks at one of my projects and says, oh my goodness, here are 20 things I can think of that relate to the history of science that your project brings to light, great, nothing would make me happier. But it is extremely important that this work is viewed as artwork, not as a creative project in the service of another discipline. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
I think so.
Carry on if you have a.
Oh, yeah.
Krista has it.
So I used to live in Philadelphia.
I'll hold
The
it.
Mutter Museum is one of my favorites of all time.
Yes, okay.
And one of the things I love about that museum is how the displays. So this museum is filled with all these specimens, right? Some of them are very grotesque. To say it's one of your favorite museums is not a lot of people can say that. But the way these specimens are displayed is it gets into this idea of curatorial influence or curatorial bias, right? In terms of how we interpret what's on, what we're looking at. And I'm curious if that's something that you have investigated or bring it to your work or thought about.
Do you mean in terms of the relationship between medical displays and art displays?
Yeah. I mean, I've always been fascinated with the vials and the specimens floating in the water, but then also like how things are spotlighted or you go into a room and it's completely dark, or things suspended from the wall, right? There's an artistry to that, and it influences how we see it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it's an excellent question. And this is something we talk about quite a bit in the art of medicine. There's such a strong relationship between the history of art museums and the history of medical museums. So if you go to, for example, the Josephinum in Vienna, you have all of these écorchés, these sort of skinned bodies that have been preserved, but they're standing in the poses of Greek statuary, right? So this like kind of, again, co-evolving and cross-informing of one another. There's a tremendous, there's been historically tremendous emphasis on that relationship. But you're absolutely right, things are, like if you look at the medical collections at Humboldt University, it's much more scaled down somehow. There isn't the artistry. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The Mutter, part of its charm as two fans of the museum is the very interesting way that those displays are staged, and I think that staging is incredibly important to bring in audiences. So if one wants to make the argument that it's the exquisite staging that captures and holds the attention of the viewer to investigate these collections further, I think that's a good thing, right? Where staging becomes really ethically, I think, complicated is in the work of Günter von Hagens, who is the father of plastination and the person who does all the Body Worlds exhibitions around the world. Because some people, I think, have argued that that's, what is the official legal term? It's somehow like the defamation of a corpse or something. What is it called? There's something of a corpse. You're not supposed to. Desecration, the desecration of a corpse. That's illegal, right? So Günter von Hagens, who has he's formalized a way of plastinating these bodies, but then he puts them in these incredibly complicated tableaus, and sometimes he makes drawers out of their organs. So you pull out a drawer and you see part of the organ. And he's trying to use those donated bodies as parts for artworks that he signs. And this is, I think, where the ethics become questionable. And my students really have a knee-jerk reaction to those works, and then I show them the history of the use of body parts in making, for example, furniture. There's a table with a human foot and bile and liver and human ears all the way around it, and it was a table that was made by an Italian artist and somebody who worked with human remains, and it was a gift to Napoleon Bonaparte. So once the students understand that history, and also understand that when you donate your body to science, you don't get to say where it goes or what happens to it. You might end up as a torso in a suitcase at a conference at the Hilton in New York. I mean, you just don't know. So the desecration of the corpse, I don't want to say it happens all the time, not trying to scare anybody. The other kind of interesting thing when I was spending time in Vienna with Edward Winter, who's an expert on the life of Josef Hürtel, excuse me, and he oversees the Nadentotem collection. He said, you know, for my friends in Berlin, because I had just come from Berlin, and he said, you know, for my friends in Berlin, their worst fear is to have a car accident in Vienna. And I said, why? He said, because your body is taken to the morgue. It's not yours. You're gone. We get to do what we want with it. And I said, that can't possibly be true. He said, the family has to make a petition to get the body back to the family if, in fact, you don't want it donated to science. So ideas about, you know, your ownership over your body after you die, I mean, it's not even a static, it's not even a singular process globally, right? There's different feelings about this. And certainly for all of those rows and rows and rows of skulls at the Mutter, if in fact the human part of the centaur has a spiritual cross-contamination with the Shetland pony and the fake vessels, then what do you think all those guys, I always imagine that they've been talking to each other for centuries, right? So no easy answers. Yeah.
Yes, John.
Sure. Your last comments got me thinking again about Foucault and thinking about the medical work, the birth of the hospital, right, in the medical gaze is early Foucault, and later that comes back again in his work on biopower and biopolitics and governmentality especially, right? And so we can see, also a big fan of the Mutter Museum, want to say East Coaster here, love it, and all the art that I see there all the time, right? And we can see the archives that you're working with are instruments of power, and you're detailing that very nicely in the work, right? So my question then is, to go back to Donna's original question about the art and the power of the art, so art as a field of knowledge, what is its power vis-a-vis systems of governmentality? Maybe the question is, what is the intervention that you see into this regime of biopolitics that you're exploring so rigorously?
That question's on here.
No, that's great. So what you're really asking about is agency, right? The agency to maybe insert these works into the broader conversations. You know, I think we're living in an era of stories. And I have my own ideas as to why that is, but you know, MIT, they might have just recently closed their Transmedia Storytelling Institute, which was founded by two people, one of them Caroline Jones. They're spatializing film and looking at what the spatialization does to those stories. You know, how does the meaning change? We're living in an era where there doesn't seem to be a single fixed truth, right? We're living in an era of my lived truth is this, that's not my experience, therefore, you know, there's not a singular narrative anymore. So I think what I'm trying to do with the project is to show all the different ways that those collections can be interpreted, you know, with a nod to the fact that they are anatomical collections, but expanding, as we can only do in the here and the now. You know, the questions that we can ask about colonial violence and about race and about gender are very different now than they were 200 years ago. So my hope is that we bring to light some of the enduring biases, right? That collection was put together based in part on our preoccupation with othering and difference. How has anything changed? We are still focused on othering and difference. So I'm trying to expand those conversations. I'm trying to be careful, and nobody wants to ventriloquize the subjects, because we're not trying to do that. We're trying to look at the conditions under which they might have been put in the collection. We're trying to look at the social and political and the cultural norms of the time that they were put into the collection. There's another artist, actually, you might be interested in looking at if you don't know her work already, is Mary Reed Kelly. Did a beautiful piece, it's a stunning piece with a really difficult subject matter, and it's called Offal, O-F-F-A-L. And she is laid out on a dissection table, and her husband Patrick is also playing in this video, and he's a doctor who's going to be dissecting her body. And she's laying on she is a suicide victim. She's a young woman who's thrown herself into the Thames River. And what she's trying to bring to light through this humorous piece, before she gets dissected, all of her organs begin to animate and they begin to talk to one another, because they know something's wrong, but they don't know that their host has committed suicide. So all the organs are talking to one another and saying, oh, this is really strange, I don't feel right. And then they begin arguing, and then even the feet get involved in the process. But she's trying to bring to light a particular historical period where young female suicide was in epidemic proportions. Why, right? So she's also looking at historical archives in her work. So the question really is, what endures? What can we know now? And for me, and we talked about this in Donna's class yesterday, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein functions as a kind of time capsule. It's both a representation of the scientific and religious and cultural norms of its time, but it gets unpacked differently each era that it's read. And this is also true, I think, with these collections. We know something very different about. So whether or not they sort of have the agency to insert themselves into the larger political strata, I'm not sure. I would like to think that art makes a difference, but it depends on who sees the work, so.
Yeah. Donna. Oh, well, I was just going to push it in a slightly different direction, maybe where I was jumping off from Jim as well, is looking at the image you had of the brain scan. There's a kind of language that we get with medical imagery over and over again, where say there's a scan of my brain, and I'll talk about the image as my brain in this weirdly objectifying mode. And there seems to be a kind of giving over to the medical community, this authority of that kind of view from nowhere objectivity, right. Because I think, in a way, that imagery disembodies the information, right? And even from ourselves. If I'm talking about my brain, looking at this, bizarre, because I'm using that brain to do this, right? So I'm wondering if you can say maybe just a little bit more about how the project that kind of pushes towards a re-embodiment of of self-awareness.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is a little bit about what I spoke about yesterday in your class about the doppelganger, right? That I gave a talk to Donna's graduate students yesterday on Frankenstein's shadow and about the sort of the predatory threat that shadow represents. It's almost an entity in and of itself. But the shadow also emerges out of German expressionist film as a doppelganger, right? The doppelganger, which has this unheimlich quality, right? The uncanny quality, because you recognize the doppelganger as both yourself but also as something outside of yourself simultaneously. The I that is also the I, right? And how can both of those conditions exist simultaneously? And that's kind of how I think about these medical images. I mean, beyond the fact that they have a certain kind of authority, yes, medical photography, photographic processes and photographic images are certainly evidence, no doubt, they are evidence. But when you see the brain, it's the same almost as seeing a mirror image or a shadow. It's the reaffirmation of the self, but the I that is somehow both you but outside of yourself. So I would tie it, I mean, the easiest way to tie that back is to the conception of the doppelganger from German Gothic horror and also English, the Gothic horror in English literary traditions. It's that idea that two things exist simultaneously, that you are yourself, but you are outside of yourself. And so maybe, I don't know, does that answer your question a little bit? Yeah.
Well, we're almost out of time, but my last question is, what's next for you? What are you tackling next?
Right. Well, it's interesting the way that art projects evolve, because this performance that we did a few weeks ago at UC Irvine at the invitation of medical.
Oh, that was just a few weeks ago.
Just a few weeks ago.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's lots of boondoggles this semester. So I would like to continue to produce live theatrical performances around this work. Adam Hogan is a brilliant, absolutely brilliant musician, so doing the live music with the performance and the live recitations, I think, is something that I would like to grow. I became a performer by accident. I was collaborating with the drama department at UCI, and they couldn't get me a third performer, so I had to step in. The show must go on, and I really enjoyed it. So I'm moving into a whole new realm of that. And I also, one last comment, and I know, I'm assuming everybody here is at the university. Is that right? None of you are from the public coming in outside the university. Something that's really difficult at my university is being taken seriously as a PI on a grant, as a principal investigator. I've written now 3 times a grant proposal to merge environmental storytelling with digital intelligence to write an AI app to help with environmental storytelling. The idea being that if we can conceptualize better stories that are less dystopian, we might actually save ourselves. We might actually not be paralyzed, and frozen in place. And this is work that's already being done by places like the Laboratory for Environmental Narratology Strategies at UCLA, founded by Ursula Heise, and her contention with conservationists is that she's basically saying the conservation narrative doesn't work. It's good, it's true, no doubt that we are losing, we've got mass, species extinction, we've got a triple climate threat, but the way that narrative is playing out in the cultural imaginary and in social spaces is not helping us to move forward and think about what is possible. So if you don't know Ursula Heise, she's absolutely brilliant, and I would look at Lens at UCLA as a model if this interests you, but that would be the next thing. If I can get this grant funded to merge environmental storytelling with digital intelligence, that'll be a whole new project.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Donna, for joining us today. I know that Dr. Seo has an announcement before we finish. You can use this one.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much again. I have an announcement. We have visitors from Korea, like artist group from Olynyk University. They're going to have a screening in the Igloo tomorrow and Friday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. So if you have any students or you have any spare time, come by. They usually create the video works for big LED walls for advertisement and promotion, but they specifically rendered the projects for the Igloo, so it would be great. And also they have an artist talk in Arc C, Architecture C building 307 tomorrow 2:45 to 4 p.m. So they're gonna share, how they created those works. So hopefully you guys can join that as well. So, and also they join here, so it's like you can meet them. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, as is our usual fashion, we will adjourn and have a chance to meet and greet. Patricia Olynyk, thank you so much for your inspiration today. Donna, thank you for joining me. Thank you all for coming. If you have guests that you would like to see in the future, please feel free to send that information either to Dr. Sale or to myself, or just let me know afterwards, and we'll see you at future events coming up. Thank you so much.